The wind reached the porch before the letter did. Margaret Ellison had read it so many times the folds had gone soft, the ink at the crease nearly worn to a whisper. 6 letters in all, kept in a cedar box that had once held her mother's buttons. Each one signed the same way, yours in earnest, Thomas Bell, and each one had built, brick by careful brick, the only future she'd let herself imagine since the fever took her parents 2 winters back. He wrote of a valley in the Wyoming territory, of red rock and sage that turned silver at dusk, of a cabin he was building with his own 2 hands. In his 4th letter, the one that had decided everything, she'd asked him, timid, half ashamed of the question whether the house got any morning light. "There's a window over where the stove will go," he'd written. "Faces the sunrise square on. You'll never have to light a lamp to see your own hands at breakfast." It was such a small promise, it undid her completely. She was 22, sharp-eyed and clever in a way that had made her more of a curiosity than a catch back in Springfield, Ohio, a girl who read newspapers instead of novels, who could tally a ledger faster than the bank clerk, and never let a man finish a sentence he hadn't thought through first. Her aunt had called it unbecoming. Margaret had called it useful, and put the very same sharpness to work writing the advertisement that started it all. "Young woman, educated, capable, seeks correspondence with a man of honest character, the West preferred." Thomas Bell's letter had come back within the month, plain and unhurried, full of fence posts and weather and the particular blue of a sky he swore had no equal, nothing flowery, nothing that asked to be believed on faith alone, or so she'd thought. The train took 4 days. She watched Ohio's green soften into Nebraska's flatness, and then the flatness begin to buckle upward into country that looked like it had never once considered a person's comfort. Somewhere past the 2nd day, the fear arrived small at first. A single cold thread pulled through the warm cloth of her hope. "I'll be waiting at the Larkspur depot, the afternoon of the 14th, his last letter said. "I'm not a tall man, but broad through the shoulder, and I'll be wearing my father's hat, the gray one. You'll know me by that, if nothing else." Today was the 14th. The conductor's voice, flat with repetition, called the stop. Margaret smoothed the collar of her traveling dress, checked that the letter was still tucked safe in her reticule, and stepped down onto a platform of unpainted boards that smelled of pitch and dust and something dry and wild she had no name for yet. The train pulled away behind her with a shudder and a long, mournful note that rolled off into the hills and did not come back. The platform was empty. No broad-shouldered man, no gray hat, just a bench worn silver by weather, a shuttered ticket window, and the enormous, indifferent sky pressing down on all of it. Something's delayed him, she told herself, and sat, and folded her hands, and waited the way she had learned to wait for everything in her life without complaint, because complaint changed nothing. The sun slid behind the ridgeline. The blue went to violet, then to a deep, star-pricked black. An hour became 2. A stooped man came out of the depot office, locked the door without a word to her, and shuffled off toward a scattering of lights that must have been the town. He was not coming. The knowledge didn't arrive like a blow. It arrived like water, finding the lowest point in a room quiet, total, inevitable. She was alone, in a territory she'd never set foot in, with one trunk and a cedar box of letters that had just become the record of a lie. She would not cry. She had promised herself that much on the train. It was the sound of wheels, not hooves, that broke the stillness, a wagon, moving at an easy pace, one lantern swinging at its side. The driver drew the team up short when he saw her, a shape against the last gray light, and for a long moment he simply looked, the way a man looks at a fence he wasn't expecting to find broken. Then he set the brake and climbed down. He was young, younger than she'd have guessed, from the unhurried way he moved, with a face weathered more by wind than years, and eyes that took her in without once making her feel looked at. He didn't ask who she'd been waiting for. He didn't ask why no one had come. He seemed to already understand that some questions belong only to the person who has to answer them. "Ma'am," he said. "Last train's long gone." "I know," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. He glanced at her trunk, her straight back. the stubborn set of her chin that she couldn't quite manage to unclench. Town's got a boarding house. Mrs. Calloway runs it. Clean rooms, decent food, and she won't ask you a single question you don't want asked. She looked at the dark road, and then at him, and understood she had no other direction to look in. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Margaret Ellison. Silas Grady." He didn't offer his hand, just nodded once, businesslike, and swung her trunk up into the wagon bed like it weighed nothing at all. "I've got feed to drop at the Mercantile first, if you don't mind the extra stop." She didn't mind. She minded nothing, just then, except the terrible silence of her own future. The ride into Larkspur took 20 minutes through country going from purple to black, the wagon wheels finding every rut with a patient, rhythmic creak. Silas didn't fill the quiet with talk, and she found she was grateful for that more than she could have said. By the time they reached the boarding house, a square, sturdy building with a lamp burning honest and yellow in the front window, she had cried exactly none of the tears sitting heavy behind her eyes, and she counted that a small victory. Mrs. Calloway opened the door before Silas had even knocked, a stout woman with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Silas Grady. What in the world?" "Found her at the depot," he said simply. "She'll need a room." The older woman's gaze moved over Margaret's pale face, her wind-mussed hair, the exhaustion she was too tired to hide anymore, and softened all at once. "Come in out of that wind, dear. You look like you've been rode hard and put away wet." Margaret turned to thank him properly, but he was already back up on the wagon seat. "Put her week on my account, Mrs. Calloway," he said, and the older woman's eyebrows rose a fraction, though she said nothing. Before Margaret could protest, could even form the words, he'd clicked to the team and rolled off into the dark, taking his lantern light with him. Her room was small, clean, and entirely her own for the first time since the funeral 2 winters back. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself come apart for the fool she'd been, for the sunrise window she'd never see, for the specific, hollow loneliness of being exactly where she'd chosen to be and belonging to no one in it. The week that followed passed in a fog of quiet mortification. She helped Mrs. Calloway with the mending and the books in exchange for her keep, and learned, in the way of small towns, that the older woman was also the postmistress, which made her the one soul in Larkspur who knew everything about everyone and repeated almost none of it. She did not pry into Margaret's circumstances, and Margaret loved her for it fiercely and silently. She saw Silas Grady only once that week, tying his horse outside the feed store, his hat pulled low, not so much as glancing toward the boarding house. She watched him from her window and felt something she refused to name pull tight in her chest. He had helped her without a single question, and then vanished like a man who did not expect thanks and did not want it. On the 7th evening, his voice carried up from the parlor, low and unhurried, speaking with Mrs. Calloway. Moments later came the knock. "Mr. Grady's asking for you," the older woman said, her face giving nothing away. He stood by the window when Margaret came down, turning his hat in his hands, filling the small room with a stillness that felt like weight. "Miss Ellison," he said, and wasted no time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Calloway tells me you've a fine hand for figures." Margaret glanced at the postmistress, who gave the smallest nod the accounts she'd helped balance in the evenings, a small order in a chaos of her own making. "I'm capable," Margaret said. "I'm not," Silas said, with a bluntness that startled her more than any flattery could have. "My father ran this ranch for 30 years, and never once let the books get past him. I've had it too, and they're past saving on my own. Ink and torn receipts, and half a year gone missing between the pages." He looked at her directly, and it cost him something to say it. She could see that plainly. "I've a room off the barn office you could use, fair wage, and your board stays here with Mrs. Calloway." It was a lifeline dressed as an errand, and she recognized it for exactly what it was. "Yes," she said, and the word came out stronger than she'd meant it to. "Yes, Mr. Grady, I'll do it." His ranch sat 3 miles out, in a fold of land cut by a creek that ran fast and cold even in the last heat of August, the very creek, she realized with a small, private ache, that Thomas Bell had described in a letter meant for a house she would never see. The cabin was plain and solid, built by hands that valued function over flourish. The office he showed her had a desk, a window, and a great deal of dust. "It isn't much," he said, almost apologetic. "It'll do," she told him, and meant it. So her days took a new shape. Each morning she walked the road out from town while the light was still gray, and each evening she walked back as it turned to copper. The ledgers were every bit the ruin he'd promised, but for Margaret, ruin was simply a puzzle that hadn't been solved yet, and she set to it with a quiet, fierce satisfaction that surprised her. Silas was gone most days, out working fence line and cattle, and she came to know him first only by the sounds of his leaving at dawn and his return at dusk. On the third morning, she found a cup of coffee waiting on the corner of her desk, still warm, no note beside it. It happened again the next morning, and the next. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him aloud. It became a ritual conducted entirely in silence, and somehow that silence said more than words could have managed. In the afternoons, he sometimes worked on the porch, mending harness or sharpening a blade, and she would catch herself watching the economy of his movements, a man who never wasted emotion, who stared at the far ridge sometimes like he was pulling patience straight out of the rock. He spoke in coffee cups and mended fences, and the particular care with which he set her trunk down that first night. It was its own language, and she was learning to read it. And he watched her too, paused in the doorway sometimes for a drink of water, watching the way the afternoon light caught the loose strands of her hair, the fierce concentration on her face as she made war on his father's terrible bookkeeping, the stacks of order growing on her desk. The house, he began to notice, felt different with her voice in it, her step on the stairs, less like a place he was simply enduring. One afternoon, 5 weeks in, he set something small and carved on the corner of her desk without a word, a little wooden fox, ears pricked, caught mid-step. She looked up, startled. "It's lovely," she said. He colored slightly, shrugged one shoulder. "Whittling passes the evenings." And he was gone before she could say more. She kept the fox on her desk after that, and touched it sometimes without quite meaning to a small, solid thing in a life that had taught her not to trust solid things too quickly. She finished the ledgers in the first week of September, 2 years of chaos folded at last into clean, patient columns. She laid the final book in front of him on the porch one evening, and he turned through it slowly, not reading the numbers so much as reading the order of them, the care in her hand. "I don't rightly know what to say," he said, quiet. "Thank you, Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it landed like something settling into place. "The work's finished," she said, and the words hung there between them, heavier than she'd expected. He closed the ledger slowly. "There's still the smokehouse accounts, and the mending if you'd—" "I could see to the mending," she said, too quickly. "Yes," he said, just as quick. "The mending." And so she stayed. The arrangement shifted without either of them naming it. She cooked the evening meal, and they ate it in a silence that had stopped being awkward weeks before. She mended his shirts, repaired the collars worn thin by sun and work. She bought a pot of black-eyed Susans in town and set it by the door, a small, bright claim on a house that had never had one, and said nothing about it, but she saw him water it one morning when he believed she wasn't looking. Thomas Bell had become a ghost by then, a foolish girl's mistake she rarely let herself revisit. Wyoming had stripped something soft out of her and replaced it with something steadier. But ghosts, she would learn, have their own schedule for returning. It happened on a bright, cold afternoon in October. She was in the front parlor waiting on a stamp while Mrs. Calloway sorted a fresh bundle of mail, murmuring to herself the way she always did. "Odd," the older woman said, holding an envelope to the window light. "Don't get much out of Cheyenne way. For a Mrs. Ruth Bell, that'll be from her husband, I'd wager. Thomas. Works the rail line out that direction. Sends a letter regular as Sunday." She glanced up, still half smiling, and the smile died on her face when she saw Margaret's. In that instant, Mrs. Calloway's sharp eyes understood everything at once the advertisement never mentioned, the empty platform, the quiet shame Margaret had worn like a second dress for months. "Oh, you poor girl," she whispered, all her briskness gone soft. It wasn't grief that rose in Margaret first. It was something colder, cleaner, a fury with edges. He hadn't simply changed his mind about her. He'd had a wife the entire time, in Cheyenne, and had spent 6 months writing pretty lies to a stranger for his own private amusement, dressing his deceit up in fence posts and creek water, and a sunrise that was never his to promise. She walked back to the ranch in a fog, dust rising pale around her boots. She had to tell Silas. Their whole arrangement had been built on his belief that she'd simply been left behind, not that she'd been used. She found him at the corral, resetting a rail, and stood watching his hands work for a moment before she could make herself speak. His hands were real. The coffee was real. Every quiet evening on that porch had been real. Silas. He turned, saw her face, went still. He set the hammer down on the post and gave her the whole of his attention, the way he gave everything. She told him plainly, Mrs. Calloway, the letter, Cheyenne, the wife named Ruth. She laid it all out flat between them, refusing to let her voice shake. He was quiet, a long moment, jaw tight, a muscle working at the corner of it. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and cold in a way she'd never heard from him. There's a marshal in Cheyenne who'd want to hear about a man running 2 households on one lie. That's fraud, plain as day. He can answer for it. She'd already turned the thought over a dozen times on the walk home. The marshal, the inquiry, her name dragged through it, the foolish girl who'd advertised for a husband and gotten played for one. She pictured it laid out in front of the whole territory and felt something in her recoil. And what would it buy me? She asked, quiet. It won't give me back what I lost believing him. That debt is mine. For being fool enough to trust a stranger's handwriting. I'd rather leave it behind me than drag it out into the light. He turned from the ridge to look at her fully, then really look. The way she imagined he looked at land before he decided what it was worth. He saw the strength in choosing to let it go rather than chase it down, and something in him that had been merely fond of her sharpened all at once into something certain. He'd gotten so used to her, the smell of bread in his kitchen, her quiet company on the porch each evening, that he hadn't once stopped to measure how much of his life she'd already become. The thought of the house going back to what it was before her arrived felt, all at once, unbearable. That evening they sat on the porch as they always did, the sky deepening to indigo, the first stars coming out hard and bright over the ridge. The quiet between them had a different weight to it tonight. Margaret, he said. She turned. Been doing some thinking. He set his hands flat on his knees, like a man bracing for something. This place was quiet, a long time before you came. Too quiet, if I'm honest, though I never let myself say so. He looked at her straight on. It doesn't feel that way anymore. He stood, walked to the porch rail, looked out at the dark shape of the ridge. I'm not a man who writes pretty letters, Margaret. I've got a hard piece of land and a slow way of seeing things sometimes. But I see this plain enough. He turned back to her. The work's done. You've no cause to stay on. But I'm hoping you will. Not as my bookkeeper. As my wife, if you'll have me. The crickets, the wind in the grass, all of it seemed to go still around the shape of what he'd just said. It wasn't romantic in the way of Thomas Bell's careful sentences. It was plainer than that, and truer for it, an offering, not a performance. She rose and stood beside him at the rail, studying the line of his jaw in the dark. Silas, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I was hoping you'd get around to asking. The smile that broke over his face then was the first true one she'd ever seen from him, and it changed him completely, lit something behind his eyes that outshone every star coming up over the ridge. They were married in November, in the small clapboard church in Larkspur, with Mrs. Calloway standing as witness and dabbing at her eyes the whole ceremony through. Margaret wore blue, sewn by her own hand. Silas wore a suit that fit him like an apology, and stood through the vows looking like a man who'd rather be facing down a stampede, and meant every word regardless. The whole town came, and watched, and nodded to each other like people who'd guessed the ending all along, and were glad to see it proven right. 4 years on, the light came long and gold across that same porch in the evening. Margaret sat with a boy's torn shirt in her lap, her needle moving steady in the fading light. while a small girl, with her father's serious eyes, lined up river stones at her feet with the gravity of a much older person. Silas came and settled into the chair beside her with the particular sigh of a man who'd spent the day branding calves and wasn't sorry for it. Their son came tearing around the side of the house, chasing a hen with a stick held like a sword. "Almost got her, Pa." "Leave that hen be, Jacob Grady," Silas said, low and amused. "She's got more sense in her than you do today." The boy grinned, dropped the stick, and leaned into his father's knee, and Silas's hand came to rest on his head without either of them thinking about it. Margaret watched them, her husband, her children, the house that had once been a stranger's plain shelter and was now unmistakably, entirely hers, and felt a peace settle over her the way dusk settles over a valley, complete and without hurry. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It hadn't been quiet in years. She looked past the corral toward the eastern rise, where the kitchen window let the first light in every single morning, exactly as a stranger's letter had once promised her it would, in a house that was never his to offer. It was a strange thing, she thought, how a lie could become a road, and a road could still lead somewhere true. "The light's especially fine this evening," she said softly. Silas looked at her and understood, the way he always did now, that she wasn't only talking about the sky. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow across her knuckles. "Still can't believe how long it took me to work up the nerve to ask you," he said, a teasing warmth in his voice. "You were slow about it," she agreed, smiling. "Good thing," he said, "that you fixed my books before you had to fix me." They sat together as the last light drained out of the sky, and the stars came on one by one, the house behind them warm and full and theirs.